memorial lecture. I resonate wholeheartedly with Mrs. White's dedication to making the Word of God accessible to the people in the pews. That is what we need in this day and time, an accessible Word. And so I'm grateful for my colleague and your rector, your pastor, Reverend Jarrett, and another colleague whom I've known and admired for many years, and I see him there, Dr. Hal Tosick, for extending this invitation to me. So my lecture this afternoon will focus on what I call the invisible lives of Ethiopic manuscripts. I am on the faculty at Howard University in Washington, D.C., but for the past several months, I have been on research leave at the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University. In the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke, there is a collection of 112 Ethiopic Ge'ez manuscripts. And I've been working on a research project dealing with the invisible lives of Ethiopic Ge'ez manuscripts. And just to give you just a brief overview, I'm looking at these 112 manuscripts, and I'm collaborating with colleagues in what's known as the Manuscript Migration Lab regarding the basic ethical questions about holding these U.S. institutions that are holding sacred African artifacts. And I'm also, in my work, highlighting texts and traditions from Ethiopian empires. This is the nature of my project at Duke University. In addition, I'm focusing on African American bibliophiles and collectors. It was not only Europeans who were collecting these manuscripts, and I'll talk a bit about that in our lecture today. And I'm working with digital humanities publishing tools and research methods. And finally, focusing on writing a book project, a monograph, dealing with ancient Ethiopia and the New Testament. And so that's what I want to share with you a bit today, is some information, some background about the book project, but also to shine light on Ethiopic manuscript collections in the U.S. This is a whole new area of inquiry. And my main goal is to help interpreters, and that is scholars, students, clergy, and laity, think more critically about how to use this material to broaden our understanding of biblical texts. So you'll see a lot of slides this afternoon because I want to showcase what's in Duke's collection. And I also want to include some background information on how I ended up in this area of research, and then share an overview of the project. And hopefully we can have some time after my talk to have some questions, and I want to hear your feedback on this material. We'll have more time for those of you who are interested to come back tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. to dig a little deeper into this material. But before I begin, I'd like for us to take a moment. We are in a holy sanctuary here. And I want us to take a moment of silence to remember and pray for those suffering and displaced from wars going on throughout the world, especially in the Ukraine, and also in northern Ethiopia, the Tigray region. The very manuscripts that I'm talking about are in this region that is war-torn. And I want us to just honor, as we honor the memory of Helen White, let us also be mindful of these lands undergoing war. So let's just have a silent prayer of remembrance. So let there be peace on earth. So, when it comes to Ethiopia in the New Testament, the starting point is usually the Ethiopian eunuch story in Acts 8, 26 to 40. Just want to leave this image up here for a minute. As the story goes, an angel spoke to Philip and summoned him to go to the south along a wilderness road from Jerusalem to Gaza. I'll click the text up there. While traveling, Philip ran into an Ethiopian who was a court official of Kandake, a queen of the Ethiopians who was returning home from Jerusalem riding in his chariot. The Spirit told Philip to go over to the Ethiopian. And when Philip ran up and heard the Ethiopian reading words from Isaiah 53, verses 7 to 8, and you can see those words there, like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, he does not open his mouth. Then Philip asked the Ethiopian, "Do you understand what you are reading?" And the Ethiopian replied, "How can I, unless someone guides me?" That's verse 31. As they continued to travel down the road together, the Ethiopian spotted some water and jumped out of the chariot and announced, "What is to prevent me from being baptized?" So Philip and the Ethiopian went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. And after this, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. Now, New Testament interpreters generally view this passage as a fulfillment of Acts 1, verse 8, which declares that Christianity is to extend to the ends of the world. Yet after this dramatic baptism scene, the Ethiopian, the queen Candace or Kandake, the kingdom of Nubia from which he traveled, and the other people who may have witnessed this encounter disappear from Luke's larger narrative as Philip is snatched away and the Ethiopian rides off in his chariot rejoicing. Now, the baptism story about the Ethiopian eunuch and Queen Kandake is not the only time that persons connected to Africa are hidden or disappear in Acts. And we'll have a chance to look at this more closely tomorrow. But if you want to take some notes, John Mark in Acts 12:12, Acts 13, verse 13, and also Acts 15, 36 to 39, known as the one who takes the gospel to Egypt, also disappears from Luke's narrative after a dispute between Paul and Barnabas. After the disagreement over whether John Mark should continue with them in their travels, Paul chose Silas, and Barnabas took John Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. Nothing more is said about John Mark, nor the teachings he spread throughout Egypt. And so, as a result of this storytelling, if you will, the way Luke creates the narrative in Acts, readers are left with the journeys of Paul around the Mediterranean as the primary lens. You see, this is the whole Mediterranean Sea. This is basically the primary lens through which to understand the development of early Christian communities. Now, novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, in her often cited TED Talk, calls attention to the danger of a single story. She recounts how she grew up in Africa, reading British children's books, through which she unwittingly absorbed the patterns, symbols, and word choices reflecting European images and ideas. Years later, when she discovered African writers, she was able to find her own authentic voice and began writing stories that reflected the world she lived in and the people who nurtured her into being. Adichie claims that if we hear or read only a single story about another person or a country, we risk a critical misunderstanding of the larger world and ourselves as unique individuals in it. And so this single world or this single story phenomenon is basically what has characterized the way in which New Testament scholars have traditionally read sources in the ancient world, especially those related to Africa. Even when there are efforts to study different trajectories of the New Testament or apply historical critical methods, these efforts are still pursued within a Western paradigm that privileges certain theological and cultural frameworks and leads to images, historical accounts, and geographical conceptualizations organized around the Mediterranean Sea. And this basically marginalizes the vast array of ethnic identities that are well represented in biblical and other sources documenting early Christianity. So I'm giving you all of this in the spirit of background, because this is what has brought me to this topic. My first book, titled Symbolic, Blackness, and Ethnic Difference in Early Christian Literature, basically falls into this trap of a single story. Even though I was talking about Egyptians, Ethiopians, blacks, and blackness in early Christian literature, I developed a taxonomy of ethno-political rhetoric in that book, but I also focused solely on Greek and Latin sources. And Jared and I were talking about this a little earlier, that our wonderful education that we had at Union Theological Seminary was still in this framework that limited our ability to ask questions or even see the worlds of the Africans that are embedded in the New Testament and other early Christian writings. And so this wonderful book that was published, and I had a chance to go out and do all kinds of talks about symbolic blackness and ethnic difference in early Christian literature. As I was talking to these different audiences, people just like you out there today were asking me, what's going on with the Ethiopians? What do we know about Ethiopian Christianity? My book was looking at the symbolic representations of the Roman writers talking about Egyptians and Ethiopians. But what about the Ethiopians themselves? Their history, their culture, their texts, their traditions, and invariably, I didn't have any good answers, because once again, I'm still locked in the dangerous trap of the single story. And this is with the PhD, this is with a published book, this is with going all across the country, doing this brand new, groundbreaking scholarship at the time. And I still had to realize this critical question: what's on the other side of the story? And that's where it takes a lot of humility as a scholar to realize that even when we've had the best professors out there, the paradigms, these colonial paradigms, these Western Eurocentric paradigms, don't enable us to raise the kinds of questions that would get us more into an African framework. And so I went about the task of redrawing, if you will, the boundaries of early Christianity by looking at the Aksumite Empire in northern Ethiopia and looking at that alongside the traditional way we have of understanding early Christianity. And it's this reshifting, if you will, of the maps and the cartography and the ways in which we even begin to conceptualize how we understand the Bible. I was able to begin to get at and acknowledge the fact that I needed to go back and learn some more. I needed to go back and retool and get a better understanding of this Aksumite Empire. Because short of doing that, we'll end up having an early Christianity that is basically, now, do you recognize the Ethiopian eunuch in this image here? Didn't look like the first image I showed you, right? But this is the danger of that single story. If we don't go back and do the retooling work, if we don't go back and reclaim the language and the literature of Ethiopia itself, and that's my basic proposition, is that we must acknowledge the ethnic context and the racialized subtext that are embedded in early Christian writings. And so I just went about unpacking what kept me away from understanding the Ethiopians themselves. And it had to do with how everything was introduced to me, but it also had to do with all of these racialized assumptions that undergird biblical scholarship to begin with. And once I started doing that and sharing material, then I was able to say, what would happen if we started with Ethiopia at the center? If we changed the map altogether, if we recentered things. Now here is a modern day map of this big, vast country, Ethiopia, right? With the capital Addis Ababa right in the center here. That Tigray region that I talked about earlier, Tigray, that's where the ancient Aksumite Empire was. This is the area now that is undergoing extreme conflict, okay? And we can see the Sudan right here, adjacent to Ethiopia. Now, when we talk about the Ethiopian eunuch, that Ethiopian eunuch didn't come from Ethiopia the way we would know Ethiopia today. The Ethiopian eunuch actually came from the Sudan. And that's why it's so important to pull back all of these different layers and put these different images in front of you when you're reading biblical texts. And that's one of the real reasons why I like to share with images, because it helps us to see how much more is behind the actual writing in the Bible. And where are these places? And so one of my big tasks is just helping readers to understand and interpreters of the Bible to understand which Ethiopia are we even talking about when we talk about Ethiopia, right? And so you won't find Kandake over here in Aksum. You find the lineage of queens known as Kandake in Nubia. Ancient Nubia is modern-day Sudan. Which Ethiopia? You see what I mean? So there's a lot of work to do here. So that's why I want to give you just an image of Nubia, just so you can see what happens when we put the Red Sea at the center. When we go along the Nile River, right? And the Mediterranean is just like, oh, it's hanging off the top left of the map. It's not the center of the map. And this is just the Nubia part of Ethiopia. Then there's Aksum. And you saw the image earlier how Aksum, again, along the Red Sea, but look at how vast it is, and look at how now Aksum is related to Nubia. You can begin to see that a little more closely. And we can also see that the Mediterranean and all the trade and all the activity happening around the Mediterranean Sea was not disconnected from what's going along in the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. All of these different trade routes, all of this interconnected activity. So it wasn't unusual for an Ethiopian or a Nubian eunuch to be moving around. We have the one story in the Acts of the Apostles, but just imagine how many stories there were like that out there. How many Ethiopians? How many Nubians? How many Africans? All of this just forces us to open up the canon, if you will, and begin to look at it in a deeper, more nuanced cultural background. So in terms of the Aksumite Empire, it is considered one of the 4 great empires of the ancient world. So Rome was not the only game in town. I like to say that so that we can just kind of acknowledge that Constantine was not the only one adopting Christianity. The Emperor Ezana here, the Emperor of Aksum, adopted Christianity roughly around 341 CE. Around the same time, are these dates ringing some bells in your head? Around the same time as Constantine. There you go. You see all of this. So that's why I want you to just kind of put some things in context today. That's why I'm putting out the big picture for you to start thinking about Persia and China and Aksum and Rome, all of these together. And there is coinage and other artifacts that bear witness to the fact that Ezana was there when he adopted Christianity. He made his own coins and had Christian symbols, if you will, on the back of the coinage. And Frumentius and Adichie, within the early church tradition, these Syrians were known as the ones who introduced Ezana to Christianity. They were shipwrecked on Aksum off of Adolis. And they were the ones, just to go back here, you see the seaport Adolis? This was just a major stop for trade. And so those Syrian merchants ended up being stuck, if you will, in Aksum, and they were brought into the royal court and introduced Christianity to Ezana. Now, I have to just spend a moment introducing the wonderful world of Ge'ez, and you did a great job. And just start using it, Ge'ez. And Ge'ez is the language of the Ethiopians in Aksum. Ge'ez is a Semitic language. I have the actual script up here, 26 characters, but it's a syllabary. And unlike Hebrew, Ge'ez is read from left to right, not right to left, as Hebrew is. Yeah? First written in this Sabaean script. The actual term Ge'ez, that says Lasana, it means the tongue of the free. The term Ge'ez means free. And I always like putting that out there so we can just begin to think about the power of language and the freedom that it gives you. And this language in particular is the language of the free. They do not teach Ge'ez in most seminaries or in most universities across the United States. And so it was no mystery that I would not have ever known about the Aksumite Empire, because it wasn't introduced to me. I was able to take Coptic, and I learned about the Nag Hammadi Library, the Gospel of Thomas, all of those Coptic sources. But readers and interpreters, or lay readers, often confuse Coptic with Ge'ez. You all will not do that, because you you have someone here saying, no, they're two different languages. And one of the problems is that when these manuscripts circulate on the market, the people in the book trade and the different merchants who are selling the manuscripts, and if you looked up Ethiopic manuscripts on Amazon, or if you go to eBay, there's a big debate and discussion about this now. There are so many Ethiopic Ge'ez manuscripts showing up on eBay now. And the label will say Coptic, which is completely incorrect. So it goes to show you that the monetary drive to capitalize on the conflict that's going on right now between Eritrea and the Ethiopians is resulting in another casualty from the war, is the loss of these sacred manuscripts and artifacts. And I just want to name that so we can be aware, because you will see Coptic and Ge'ez confused. And I just want to introduce this to you. The Ethiopians had their own language known as Ge'ez, and Ge'ez is still the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church today. So it is still a living language within the life of Ethiopian communities and liturgical communities. Amharic is the modern version of Ethiopic, if you will. Amharic is what current Ethiopians speak now. That's the lingua franca of Ethiopia. But Ge'ez is still being used in churches today. And just to give you some context, and I found this helpful in academic audiences, and I wanted to share this with you as well, in terms of the language tree. So it's not like our Semitic scholars or our Hebrew Bible scholars didn't know about Ge'ez, because it's right alongside Hebrew and Aramaic, Arabic. You see the various Semitic languages here? But there's a whole tree of Ethiopian languages where you have Ge'ez and Tigrinya. That's the language up in Eritrea. You have the Amharic and Garage. So I just want you to kind of put this in context, that this is a thriving language. And so it comes down to, what do we choose to focus on and teach and introduce to our clergy, who can then introduce it to laity and help have a richer, more broader, culturally rich understanding of early Christianity. So now, for you to just have some background on how I came into all of this to begin with, I wanted to shift, and my first shift had to happen with learning the language. So I did my own self-study of the language. I consulted with a professor who was teaching at Harvard University, and I studied all these other biblical languages. So I'm like, okay, let me go ahead and add this Ethiopic to my toolkit, right? And in doing that, and my preliminary research led me to this man by the name of Tweed, and I learned about a collection of Ethiopian sacred artifacts which had started out in Los Angeles, California, but had now been donated to Howard University. And that was the first door that opened for me. And in that catalog, so that catalog was documenting an exhibit that was put on back in Los Angeles in the 80s. And in that catalog, so all I have is a catalog, right? And in that catalog, I saw this image of what it's hard to read this. I'll read it for you. It says, New Testament, early 15th century, possibly 14th century, pseudepigrapha work called The Acts of St. Paul and Other Apostles. So as a New Testament critic, of course, I wanted to get my hands on this and learn more about it. And I also wanted to learn more about Dr. Andre Reynolds Tweed. He was an alum, and I know we have some Howard University alumni in the audience here. He was an alum of Howard University. He went to the College of Medicine, and he graduated and went on. He graduated in 1942 and went on to become the first board-certified Black psychiatrist in California, and he practiced in Los Angeles for a number of years. He was an avid collector of Ethiopian artifacts and manuscripts from Harlem of Jamaican heritage. And so then I learned that Dr. Tweed donated a one-time donation, his complete collection of Ethiopian artifacts and manuscripts. He donated those to Howard University's School of Divinity in December of 1993, shortly before he passed away. And this is setting up, how do these Ethiopian sources even end up in our universities? And the collection we have at Howard ended up in this way. And he donated a total of 240 artifacts, and that included the 150 manuscripts, 100 books and codices, and 50 scrolls. Did you have a? Yes. Yeah. That is always the question. And what I'm doing in the Manuscript Migration Lab is exploring this question of provenance. Because what we're looking at is the original home of the manuscript, right? But look, he's a collector. And that is the question, how does a Dr. Tweed, he obviously traveled to Ethiopia, and he went back and forth, and over those years, he built relationships, and he was an art connoisseur and just amassed his own collection. And that's what my book project will actually talk about, these different collections, the one at Howard, the one at Duke, the one at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and also the one at Princeton University. And I want to just look at how these different collectors went about their activities. And so in the Howard Tweed collection, we have biblical, liturgical, theological, hagiography, those are holy writings of the saints, magical or religious scrolls, and it's very unique that Howard has a large amount of medical texts, and for obvious reasons. You can see someone who was a physician and went on to be a psychiatrist, and poetry. And so my first trip, as I'm learning my Ge'ez and starting to actually retrieve manuscripts in the Ethiopic Ge'ez tradition, I traveled to Washington, D.C. to actually look at this manuscript. And here is my own image of the manuscript of the Acts of Paul. And what I found when I was looking at this is that it also had another manuscript embedded in it, and that's the Acts of Cerebellum, one of the church fathers of the Ethiopian tradition. Now, if I had not gone to Howard to actually look and turn the pages of the manuscript itself, I would have never known that Cerebellum was even in there. Because the catalog entry, what did it give me? It just gave me this first image here. And that's the value of knowing what's in these collections, though. And that's the value of having them cataloged and also digitized. But nothing takes away from that actual experience of sitting in a rare book room and just going through and touching these manuscripts and feeling the life of the manuscript itself. And that's why my project is looking at the invisible lives of Ethiopic manuscripts to make the point that the manuscripts have a life of their own, independent of the content that is on the pages. And as New Testament critics, right, and I see Dr. Tausig back there nodding his head, we're trained to go deep into the text. We're taught to read what's in the text, what's on the page. Is it in the text? And some of us who are lucky are encouraged to go beyond the canon, the canonized text. But rarely do we ask about the actual life of the manuscript itself. How did it move from hand to hand? How did it even get out of Ethiopia, which I'm going to segue a bit more to talk about how I wanted to learn more about this text. And so I went to the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Collegeville, Minnesota, that took microfilm images of Ethiopic manuscripts back in 1975. And you can see this is a microfilm image of the same text that I actually looked at Howard University. But when you get to the actual record in the microfilm, and you can't see this very well here, but it has property on there. And property is referring to that notion of provenance. Who is the owner? And right here I can guarantee you, and you can look closely at the slide after we're done, it does not say Howard University. I can tell you that. The property says the Deborah Labanos Monastery in Ethiopia, which makes sense. That's the rightful home of these manuscripts. But some kind of way, and I can't answer your question, how did Dr. Tweed get the manuscript? He's not here to tell his story, and I haven't been able to find any descendants of Dr. Tweed. And that's the thing, to get the stories about the collectors. So that's part of my research now, is continuing to see what I can learn about Dr. Tweed and how he went about amassing his own collection. So this was a provenance discrepancy that I stumbled into long before I was on the faculty at Howard University. So what do you do with something like that, right? And that's when, consulting with my senior colleagues, Ethiopian scholars, at that point, there wasn't a context for even raising these kinds of questions. And this is about 15 years ago or so now. And so my colleague just encouraged me to keep focusing on my own New Testament work and, just keep kind of doing your own text critical work. And it took, and I guess this is where the hand of God is really in the life of a scholar, and I'm not ashamed to say that today, because I was at Colgate Rochester Divinity School in Rochester, New York, when I first started this research, an outsider to Howard University, right? So who am I and what am I to say, a junior professor? So I tucked it away. I wrote up my research report for that fellowship that I had at the time, and I went on with my publishing and my other research. And then, years later, I ended up being invited to join the faculty at Howard University. And also in an administrative capacity where I did have something at stake. And I did have some authority to work with the university and seeing if we could send this manuscript back home. And that's what we did. And so that's another whole lecture, another whole long story. I'll kind of allude to it when I come to the end of the lecture today. But what I want to do now is give you an overview of Duke's collection. So that's Howard's collection. And like I said, currently I'm at Duke University. Many are surprised to even know that Duke has a collection of Ge'ez manuscripts. They have 112 of them. It's a wonderful collection. And 47 magic or religious scrolls, 5 amulets, 2 different icons, and 58 codices. Those are the book manuscripts, and the scrolls are rolled up. And I'll show you some images of these. There are 2 catalogs of this material, and remember how I've talked about how important it is to have the catalog material? There are 2 catalogs. Only one is published that covers manuscripts 1 to 29. The other nearly 90 manuscripts have been looked at. There are catalog descriptions, but it is still unpublished. So the general public has no way to get to this material. And like the Howard collection, they're biblical hymns, liturgical, hagiographies, magic. So this is looking familiar to you. But you can see there are no medical texts in the Duke collection. You see that? And so what I've been doing at Duke in my research, because all Duke has is a website, you can go and look up Duke Ethiopic manuscripts, and you will see the website that shows the 112 manuscripts. And they basically have these descriptions on the website. So that's what I've cut and paste into this. So you can get a basic general idea of what's in the collection, but you can't get the visual. And it's certainly not cataloged fully, and it's not digitized. So if you wanted to learn more about these, if you wanted to do a Bible study on this material, you'd be a little hard-pressed. And I'm hoping my book will be able to help out in that regard, to start putting some of these manuscripts into a way that you can easily access them. So look at this. The very first manuscript that came to Duke came in 1964. And look at how beautiful it is. I mean, that's a velvet. You can tell from the image you're looking at. If you saw it in person, it's absolutely amazing. Velvet and gold braid ornamentation. So back to your question again, how did this manuscript land in the hands of somebody in France? Because look, we have a little image in the cover of the manuscript that shows one of the owners. How does it get it? And there were several owners before it even came to Duke de Liancourt, who put his little, imprimatur right there in the manuscript. How do we tell these stories? There's another manuscript about the 4 Gospels. This is what a typical manuscript has, these wood boards. That's why looking at that, all of that velvet and everything, I'm like, whoa, where did that one end up? Because usually they're wood boards with the parchment that's stitched and put into the form of a manuscript. You see this? There are illuminations in the manuscripts. This is in that one, the 4 Gospels. Often the illuminations are added later. So the scribes just write up these different manuscripts, and then to increase the selling value of the manuscript, the price of it, these illuminations are added later. And here's where I just want to take you through and just show you some examples. There's a Gospel of John in the collection with these illuminations. Letters of Paul. So as a New Testament critic, I'm trying to make an argument that if we want to learn more about Ethiopian Christianity beyond that Ethiopian eunuch story, where can we go? And I contend that we can go to the sources that are right in our own institutions. And I'm working with a book title, Hidden in Plain Sight. They're right there, but they're invisible. We have no way of knowing about them. We have no guide to teach us what's in there and how do we read this material. They're right there, the letters of Paul. This donation was made by a man by the name of Ernest Moreau, who right before he passed away, donated his collection to Duke in 2008. So I showed you the one, manuscript number 1, that came in 1964. Here's manuscript number 112 that came 44 years later in 2008. That's a very different history of collecting, an ongoing history of collecting at Duke University. And you can see the little scribbles, right, in manuscripts. The lives, the hands that touch them. The hymns, so there are different hymns, degwa, hymns for the period of Lent. We're going into Lent now. Our Ethiopian brothers and sisters are also going into Lent. And they have a special hymn book for this time of the year. And it's called the degwa, these hymns for the period of Lent. And so you can see the board here. You get some idea, this book of hymns. But you see the 3 columns. And if you look closely, and I can't read the musical notations and all of this, that's why we'll need all types of specialists. And that's what I'm hoping for, to come in and help us to understand what's in these collections. Because basically, when Robert Garrett or the collectors at Duke, when they collect, they're doing it as a hobby. They're just saying, oh, this looks interesting. Let me buy some of these manuscripts. They don't have a clue what's in there. They're not thinking about what's in there. And it's our responsibility to honor this tradition, to learn about the tradition, and to begin to think about how, look at this, how do we make use of this material? So there are a lot of hallelujahs in this manuscript. That's part of their tradition, hallelujah. And you can see it repetitively. But I need to consult and collaborate with Ethiopian priests. And we had talked about this, Jared, when we were planning for this lecture. We have to come out of our Western normative ways of the hymn books and the things that we use in our tradition. It's a whole different tradition. And then there are dekwa for the whole year. You know how we have ordinary time, if you will? They have their special seasons. And so now I'm just going to kind of go through so you can see some more hymns, these different books. But it's just fascinating to consider all of the material here. Hymns to Mary. The Ethiopian tradition venerates the Virgin Mary. And once again, we have another hymn book, but look, this was a living document that moved around with whoever. So to me, and I said this in other talks about this, I'm curious about what's in the book, but I'm just as fascinated by the string. It makes me think about who was carrying that book. Where were they going? Right? What difference does it make? Now you can begin to see, and I'm not a professional photographer, right? So these are my own images that I've taken since I've been at Duke to just capture what's going on in this collection. The music. Then there are prayer books. And these are very tiny, small, some of them about the size of your iPhone today. You can't tell that from this image here. They're very tiny little prayer books that folks would have carried around with them. You see? And so there's just, like I said, 112 different prayers, the monastic prayers in the tradition. Here's another holding case for the prayers, books, and the hymnals. And look at the textile material. So there's a lot that can be done with this material, but we can't do anything. The hagiographies, Tekla Hymanot, he was the the patron saint of that Deborah Libanos monastery I mentioned earlier. He's the founder of that monastery in Ethiopia. He's a famous, if you want to look up somebody, Tekla Hymenot, for the monastic tradition in Ethiopia. But look at this. So Duke simply has their acquisition records saying that it was purchased from this rare book and manuscript house in 1994. That kind of thing. You see that? And that's where the work of the Manuscript Migration Lab that I'm a part of in my own work is trying to go behind these auction houses and these rare book dealers to uncover their practices and to really help us to think about what's going on with this. I want to flip through. Here's one image. Now here's a manuscript. Does that look very Ethiopian to you? And what I did, I took the back of the page. So the left is what it looks like. So apparently when the manuscript came to whoever owned it, they said, let me put an image that kind of will make it my own. And they stitched it. Look, this is the back. Look at this. I'm in the strings and stitches, you can see. So it tells a story. So this question about what are we doing with these sacred objects, these manuscripts? Yes, it's important what's in there, but to me the real story is, who does this? And how long did it stay there before it got to the rare book dealer, before it got to the librarian at Duke, who told the administration at Duke, oh, we need to purchase this? There's a lot for us to look at with this. So these are scrolls now. So you see the difference between the scroll and the codex. And these prayer scrolls would have been rolled up tightly and fit into this, what's known as an amulet. And again, you could put a string on that and wear it around your neck. And here's some sample prayer scrolls that focused on prayers for protection against different demons, prayers for one's children, prayers for economic relief in time of distress. So here's just an example of how I just rolled the scroll out just to take an image of it. And the real work will be, how do we actually catalog a scroll versus a codex? A codex has pages or folios, one recto verso. You know, you can number pages, right? How do you organize a scroll to be able to describe? Okay, so 5 inches down, but that's the work that I'm doing. So once again, learning Ethiopian scribal practices, learning cataloging techniques of how to describe this material. What I'm doing is the kind of work no one person can do alone, right? This is obviously a collaborative project here. Just some of the images. And then there are theological texts. And I just want to note that Duke has some Arabic manuscripts that come from Ethiopia. We often forget about our Muslim brothers and sisters, but there's some Arabic Qurans that come from Ethiopia in terms of interfaith dialogue. This could be a place to do that. But here's that website I talked to you about. If you type in Rubenstein, Ethiopic manuscripts, but you can see the Arabic ones as well. And so I just want to summarize this, that Duke's collection history took place over a number of decades as compared to Howard's one-time donation. And it was generated by actual librarians on the staff and faculty members in the School of Divinity at Duke who were interested in this. And then a lot of their collection came from private donors and the book dealers and auction houses. So that's what I've gone through and just tried to make sense out of all of this material and put it in a way that we can easily talk about it. So you can see the private donations, the actual purchases, and from whom, and some of these unnamed people we don't know. A lot of Duke's manuscripts just say it just came in, the only record they have is it came in from 1964 to 71. Okay, I know, but a lot of my ancestors were doing in the 60s, right? So here's what was going on in another context, right? So I'm part of the lab. I've already talked to you about that. But I want to just summarize by saying that what I'm trying to encourage you to see and open up to is how we can get a whole new frame of reference for understanding the New Testament when we pull in Ethiopic empires and Ethiopic sources into conversation. And so my project is centering Ethiopian empires, Aksum and Nubia. I'm recognizing the Black bibliophiles and collectors. And I think it's important to do this, to see that African Americans were interested in this type of material as well. But as you can also hear, I'm very much committed to acknowledging and honoring the multiple lives of manuscripts, these Ethiopic manuscripts, and doing so by considering these manuscripts living witnesses. They have lives of their own. And my particular work is informed by what I call communities of accountability. And that's what brings me to a place like St. Martin's in the Field, where I can actually talk to parishioners and lay leaders and clergy leaders for us to think about, how do we do this work responsibly? How can I go about continuing to talk about this material in a way that honors the tradition itself and the people of Ethiopia, but in a way that also showcases the practices of collecting? And then we can deal with the ethical and legal questions that, of course, hovering all around this. What is our responsibility when we do have manuscripts like this? And so what I'm sharing with my colleagues at Duke, and I'll do it with the other colleagues at these other universities, is that at a minimum, we have a responsibility to make this material accessible. It's not enough to feel good and proud that you have all of this stuff and you got this really robust, rare book and manuscript collection. But what is our responsibility as stewards of this material? That's what I want us to think about. And if it's hidden, who would ever know? Imagine the students, how their worlds, undergraduate students. I've done some talks for a comparative literature class. This is literature, if you will. And the students, when they're 18 and 19 years old, can be introduced to this material. To know that Africa is just a part of the ancient world, just like all the other ancient cities, from Jerusalem on to Rome to Syria, Lebanon, what have you, Nubia, Aksum. They can begin to have a vocabulary that increases cultural literacy. And I'm kind of naming that. Every time I do a talk, something new comes out of my mouth. But hold me accountable, community. And now you all are part of my community of accountability, if you will. Every time I do a talk, our worlds come together. You all can email me and say, okay, what's going on? Where are you? What do you need? Right? That's how we do this. And so just to showcase one of the chapters in the book, the first chapter will deal with which Ethiopia, kind of dealing with the map issue and knowing what we mean when we even say Ethiopia. The second chapter is where I will showcase these Ethiopic collections in the U.S. as textual witnesses, and I think I'm going to shift that to living witnesses, right? To start claiming my own language around this, right? And this will give the background and content of these 4 collections. I've decided to narrow it down to Duke, Howard, Catholic, and Princeton. I have connections at all of those universities, and we can begin to do some archival research and really bring this material to life. Revealing the invisible, that's the first part of the book. So we can begin to talk about Ethiopia. We can begin to know that, yeah, there's a tradition there. We're not just making this up. They're not just some exotic people out there. They're practicing people of faith, just like we are. And they have their own sources, their own canon, if you will, their own practices. And the more we can learn about them, the more we can honor the place and the people, the more we can recognize. And these are some more, you've heard me use that term, bibliophiles. I'm fascinated by these librarians and book collectors who help curate African sources. That's what this is about. Dorothy Porter Wesley at Howard University, Mamie Clayton from UCLA. She was a librarian for like 50 years. And bit by bit, she amassed her own collection of African American sources, and Vivian Harsh, likewise, in Chicago, Illinois. And so that's what we're doing this work together. And I think on that note, I've gone a nice little bit of time here, but on that note, I think I'll stop and just see if you all have any questions. Yeah.